Imagine you woke up one morning and every neighbor on your block was friends with your worst enemy. Now imagine that has been true for 50 years. Now imagine you have 1.4 billion people to feed, almost no domestic oil, less than 10% of the world's arable land, and the entire global trading system was designed by the country you are trying to replace. That is China. Every single morning. This video is not going to tell you China is about to conquer the world. That is not accurate. It is also not going to tell you China is a paper dragon. America does not need to take seriously. That is even less accurate. China is the most complex and most consequential strategic challenge the United States has ever faced. Not because it is all-powerful, because it is powerful, motivated, patient, and hemmed in. A caged tiger is still a tiger. A caged tiger with something to prove is the most dangerous animal in the room. This is the real China story. Section 1. The Ring Around China. To understand Chinese foreign policy, start with a map. Pull up the Pacific and start placing American military assets and allies. Japan sits off China's eastern coast. The United States maintains approximately 54,000 troops there, along with air bases, naval facilities, and the home port of the 7th Fleet. Japan and China have centuries of conflict behind them, including Japan's invasion of China in the 1930s and 1940s that killed an estimated 10 to 20 million Chinese civilians. That history has not been forgotten in Beijing. South Korea. American forces have been stationed on the Korean peninsula since 1950. Approximately 28,500 troops remain. It sits a few hundred miles from the Chinese coast. Taiwan. The island Beijing considers a breakaway province. The United States has maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity about its defense for decades. Taiwan sits roughly 100 miles off the Chinese mainland and produces the most advanced semiconductors on Earth. More than 90% of the world's most cutting-edge chips are manufactured there. Everything from the guidance systems and American precision weapons to the phone in your pocket depends on that production continuing uninterrupted. The Philippines. A treaty ally. American forces have returned to Philippine bases. The Philippines sit directly across the South China Sea shipping lanes, through which enormous portions of China's imports and exports flow daily. Australia. A Five Eyes intelligence partner, host to American Marine rotations, and increasingly integrated into American Pacific defense through the AUKUS nuclear submarine agreement. India. Not a formal American ally, but a Quad partner, alongside the United States, Japan, and Australia. India also shares a 2,100-mile disputed border with China, fought a war with it in 1962, and has skirmished at that border repeatedly since. India and China together account for nearly 3 billion people and share one of the most militarized frontiers on Earth. Now stand in Beijing and look at that map. Every maritime exit is flanked by American allies or American bases. The first island chain, stretching from Japan through Taiwan through the Philippines, forms a barrier Chinese naval forces cannot cross freely. This is not an accident. It is 50 years of deliberate American strategic architecture built specifically to contain Chinese power projection. It has also produced, entirely predictably, a Chinese leadership that has organized its entire national security strategy around one goal: breaking out of this ring before it gets tighter. Understanding that context does not excuse Chinese aggression or human rights violations. Without it, nothing Beijing does makes strategic sense. And without strategic sense, you cannot anticipate what is coming next. Section 2. The economy. Real strength. Real cracks. China's economic rise is one of the most significant events in modern history. In 1980, China's per capita income was roughly comparable to sub-Saharan Africa. By 2024, China's GDP had reached approximately $18.8 trillion, the second largest on Earth by nominal output. By purchasing power measurements, it is already the largest economy in the world. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of extreme poverty within a single generation. China is the world's largest manufacturer, largest exporter, and largest trading nation. The American economy is deeply dependent on Chinese manufacturing, a dependency that became painfully visible during the pandemic, when the United States could not reliably produce basic medical supplies. That dependency did not emerge by accident. It was built over decades through pricing advantages, subsidized state enterprises, and a manufacturing scale no other country could match. but the official growth numbers consistently overstate what is actually happening inside the Chinese economy. The Rhodium Group estimated that China's actual GDP growth in 2024 was between 2.4 and 2.8%, significantly below the 5% the government officially reported. When independent economists put the real number at roughly half the official figure, that gap tells you something important. The real estate sector is in genuine distress. Property historically accounted for roughly 25% of China's GDP. Evergrande, once the world's most valuable real estate company, defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. That collapse wiped out the primary savings vehicle for tens of millions of Chinese middle-class families whose wealth was stored almost entirely in property values. Real estate development investment fell nearly 10% year-on-year in early 2025, and the recovery remains weak. Youth unemployment hit 21.3% in mid-2023, after which the Chinese government stopped publishing the data for several months, citing a need to review the methodology. When a government pulls an economic indicator because the number is too embarrassing, that is the indicator. The figure resumed publication at a lower level that many economists view skeptically given the methodology changes. As of July 2025, it had climbed back to 17.8% for the 16 to 24 age group, an 11-month high, reflecting persistent hiring difficulties across technology, real estate, and education sectors. China is powerful. China is also running on a treadmill that is getting faster. With structural problems, its leadership cannot easily discuss publicly. Both things are true simultaneously, and that combination matters for everything that follows. Section 3. The nuclear picture. Here is the China nuclear number most people do not know. China currently possesses an estimated 600 nuclear warheads, according to the Pentagon's 2025 annual report to Congress. The United States holds approximately 3,700, and Russia around 4,300, according to the Federation of American Scientists. By raw count today, China is not the existential nuclear threat Russia represents. What matters is the trajectory. Satellite imagery beginning in 2021 revealed 3 entirely new ICBM silo fields under construction in the Chinese interior. The Pentagon's 2025 report assessed that China has likely loaded more than 100 solid propellant ICBM silos at those fields with DF-31 class missiles. The Pentagon projects China will exceed 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030, deployed at higher readiness levels than China has ever maintained. China has also been developing hypersonic glide vehicles, weapons traveling at more than 5 times the speed of sound at low altitude, making them significantly harder to intercept than traditional ballistic missiles. In 2021, China tested a hypersonic glide vehicle that circled the globe before descending on its target. American officials publicly admitted it had surprised them. The existing nuclear arms control architecture was designed for a 2-party American-Russian framework. It does not cover China. There are no verified limits on China's buildup, no inspection rights, no shared communication protocols at the level that exist between Washington and Moscow. The world's fastest-growing nuclear arsenal is also the least constrained by formal agreements. China is not a nuclear peer today. It is building toward parity on a timeline measured in years, not decades. That timeline is the planning horizon every American defense strategist is now working inside. Section 4. The war already being fought. The conflict between China and the United States is not a future event. It is happening now. It is being fought in a domain most people cannot see. The Office of Personnel Management breach of 2014 and 2015, attributed to Chinese state actors, exfiltrated the security clearance files of approximately 22 million current and former federal employees. These files contain financial histories, family relationships, foreign contacts, and psychological evaluations submitted for background investigations. China now holds a detailed map of the vulnerabilities and pressure points of millions of people who hold or have held security clearances. For American counterintelligence, it was a generational loss. Then, Volt Typhoon. In 2023 and 2024, Microsoft, the FBI, CISA, and the intelligence agencies of the Five Eyes Alliance identified a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group that had embedded itself inside American critical infrastructure, not stealing data in the traditional sense, pre-positioning, burrowing into water systems, power grids, and telecommunications networks, mapping how they function, and establishing the access needed to disrupt them. CISA Director Jen Easterly testified to Congress in January 2024 that the threat was not theoretical. Her agency had found and removed Chinese intrusions across multiple infrastructure sectors and described what had been found as likely just the tip of the iceberg. FBI Director Christopher Wray testified at the same hearing that China had gained illicit access to telecommunications, energy, water, and other infrastructure networks. In December 2024, according to the Wall Street Journal, Chinese officials at a meeting in Geneva made remarks American officials described as a tacit acknowledgement that China was behind the Volt Typhoon operations, not a public admission. Enough to confirm what every independent cybersecurity assessment had already concluded. The goal, per American intelligence assessments, was specifically to build the capability to disrupt American infrastructure in a conflict over Taiwan, degrading public will to support military action and complicating the government's ability to mobilize a response. The switch has not been thrown. The access has already been established. That distinction matters enormously and is not discussed nearly enough in mainstream coverage of the China threat. In late 2024, a separate Chinese state group called Salt Typhoon penetrated American telecommunications companies, accessing communications data and law enforcement information. The U.S. government confirmed it and sanctioned a Chinese cybersecurity company believed to have enabled the attacks. The FBI has formally assessed that China represents the most significant counterintelligence threat America currently faces. The war is happening. Most Americans do not know the scale of it. Section 5. The Hunger and Energy Trap. China has less than 10% of the world's arable land and must feed nearly 20% of the world's population, according to CSIS. It also holds only 6% of the world's freshwater resources. The math does not work without imports. China has been a net importer of agricultural products since 2004. It is the world's largest importer of soybeans, accounting for more than 60% of total global soybean trade. Between 2013 and 2019, China lost more than 5% of its total arable land due to environmental degradation, according to its own government figures. The Council on Foreign Relations noted that famines and food crises were historically the graveyards of Chinese dynasties, repeatedly sparking the political uprisings that brought down entire governments. The Chinese Communist Party is acutely aware of this history. It is why Xi Jinping has made food security a personal political priority, passing a new national food security law in 2024, imposing stricter controls on how agricultural land can be used. Then, energy. Approximately 80% of China's crude oil imports pass through a single chokepoint, the Strait of Malacca, a waterway less than 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Roughly 23 million barrels of oil cross it every day. Former Chinese President Hu Jintao named this vulnerability explicitly in 2003, calling it the Malacca Dilemma, the recognition that a hostile power controlling that strait could strangle China's economy without firing a shot on Chinese soil. China has spent 2 decades trying to solve it. Pipelines from Russia, a pipeline from Myanmar, rail corridors through Central Asia. All of it combined moves roughly 3.7 million barrels per day through land routes, according to modern diplomacy. China consumes approximately 15 million. The arithmetic does not close. A country that cannot reliably feed itself and cannot reliably fuel itself, in a conflict scenario involving American naval dominance, is fighting against a clock from the first day. That clock shapes every military calculation Beijing makes about Taiwan, about the South China Sea, and about the pace of its naval buildup. It is not pride driving the urgency, it is arithmetic. Section 6. The Africa Play. China has been playing on the Africa chessboard for 20 years while Washington largely watched. The approach is straightforward. China offers African governments infrastructure investment with no governance strings attached. No conditions about human rights or press freedom. Build the road, build the port, build the railway, access the resources. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa was built and gifted by China. It was later discovered the building's communication systems had been compromised, and Chinese intelligence had been reading African Union internal communications from inside the building they constructed. Africa holds approximately 90% of the world's cobalt and platinum, half its gold, 2/3 of its manganese, and 35% of its uranium, according to 2025 analysis. These are not peripheral commodities. They are the materials inside every electric vehicle battery, every smartphone, and every advanced weapon system. China has invested in 15 out of 17 cobalt mining operations in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Chinese policy banks issued $24.9 billion in Belt and Road linked mining loans in just the first half of 2025 alone, more than in all of 2024, itself a record year. Developing nations now owe China at least $1.1 trillion in outstanding debt. The Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, built with Chinese financing, was leased to a Chinese state company for 99 years after Sri Lanka could not manage its debt obligations. 12 African nations are currently in debt distress with Chinese creditors. Whether these outcomes reflect deliberate strategic design or simply the predictable result of lending to high-risk borrowers without adequate safeguards is debated by researchers. What is not debated is the outcome. China ends up with operational influence over strategic assets in countries that owe it money. With 54 votes in the United Nations General Assembly, Africa is the diplomatic bloc China needs most to resist Western pressure in international institutions. The infrastructure investment and the diplomatic alignment are not separate strategies. They are the same strategy. And America, which only seriously began trying to compete through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, is attempting to close a 20-year gap against an adversary with fewer political constraints and deeper existing relationships on the ground. Section 7. The Caged Tiger. Put the whole picture together. China is the second largest economy on Earth by nominal output, and by purchasing power measurements already the largest. It has a military modernizing at a speed with no modern precedent, designed specifically to counter American power projection in the Pacific. It has 600 nuclear warheads and is building toward 1,000 by 2030. It runs the most aggressive foreign intelligence operation targeting the United States of any country in the world. It has pre-positioned cyber access inside American critical infrastructure. It has spent decades securing critical mineral supply chains across Africa worth hundreds of billions in investment. And it cannot feed itself without imports, cannot fuel itself without passing through a strait it does not control, is aging faster than it is developing, with a fertility rate of approximately 1.40 and a population projected to shrink significantly by mid-century, spends as much money surveilling its own citizens as on external defense, has a real estate sector that wiped out the savings of tens of millions of middle-class families, has youth unemployment serious enough that the government stopped publishing it. This is the tiger, powerful, motivated, and facing structural constraints that make its long-term trajectory deeply uncertain. The Taiwan question is where all of it converges. The Pentagon's 2025 annual report stated plainly that the People's Liberation Army expects to be able to fight and win a war over Taiwan by 2027. In 2024, China tested what the Pentagon described as essential components of Taiwan invasion options, including exercises to strike sea and land targets, hit American forces in the Pacific, and block access to key ports. This is active preparation, not theoretical planning. A Chinese military move on Taiwan would be the most consequential geopolitical event since the Second World War. It would trigger American military involvement, devastate the global semiconductor supply chain, and produce a conflict neither side could easily control. The economic disruption would be measured in tens of trillions of dollars. Every financial market on Earth would be affected within hours. Does China want that conflict? The rational calculation says no. The cost would be extraordinary, and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. But a Chinese government facing domestic economic pressure, demographic decline, and a population told for decades that Taiwan's return is a national mission does not always have the luxury of pure rationality. The best outcome is sustained deterrence. American presence strong enough that the cost of aggression remains prohibitive. Economic relationships complex enough to create mutual vulnerability on both sides. Diplomatic channels open enough to prevent miscalculation from becoming catastrophe. America's China strategy has to thread a needle that demands clear eyes about both sides of the Pacific, strong enough to deter, engaged enough to prevent escalation, honest enough to see the structural pressures building inside China that its own government cannot publicly acknowledge. China is not 10 feet tall. It is a country with genuine power, genuine ambition, genuine grievances about its encirclement, and genuine structural weaknesses. Its leadership works very hard to keep its own citizens from discussing. The cage is real. The tiger is real. The question for American strategy is not whether to fear the tiger. It is whether to keep the cage strong or hand the tiger a key by being too indebted, too distracted, and too politically divided to maintain the presence that has kept the Pacific stable for 80 years. The one thing that benefits China more than any military buildup, any cyber operation, or any Belt and Road investment is an America that loses confidence in itself. Do not give them that. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, the next one goes deeper still. Subscribe and turn on notifications. It is the only way to catch it when it drops.